I'm Bruce Aitken, the author, along with my colleague Ngozi Fonthcom, of Trade Crash, a new book that's a trade primer on surviving and thriving pandemics and global trade disruption. This is a book video or a book vid in that it contains about 40 minutes of interviews, including this one, and a short film. In addition, it covers a variety of topics that it seems to me are timely. We have authors, 7 authors, from a variety of countries and cultures: China, India, Malaysia, South Korea, the United States, and others. The topics we cover are the failure of globalization and 7 proposals to try to remedy this. In addition, we discuss the history of trade wars and the evolution of the multilateral trading system and its failure in the last 26 years to produce a new multilateral free trade agreement, the last being the Uruguay round. The heart of the book, however, is a discussion of the fractures to the international trading system and to the supply chain caused by the Trump administration's aggressive trade policies, some of which have been successful, but nearly all of which, especially trade by Twitter, have been disruptive. In addition, we discuss COVID-19, which brought the world economy to a global slowdown, if not lockdown, beginning 6 months ago. We discuss the impact of this on the election and include an apocryphal depiction of the political resurrection of Donald Trump. Finally, we conclude with a discussion of the reasons why we feel there will be a global economic crash, a trade crash. The interviews will be conducted by Ngozi Fonthcom, my colleague and friend since we met in Malaysia 6 years ago. So I'm going to turn this over to Ngozi.
So to give you some background on some context on how we got started writing this book. We started writing this book just over 3 years ago as a result of the disruption to the global economy caused by the so-called Trump's trade war with China. At that time, our goal was to educate and provide the business community with some needed context on the drivers of the international trading environment and to equip them with the necessary tools to adapt, manage, and survive the trade disruption by providing practical solutions to real-time trade compliance challenges caused by the tariffs. And then COVID-19 came and caused more damage to the global economy than anything that President Trump's trade policy could ever have done. So myself and my co-author felt that any book on trade disruption needed to include a chapter on COVID-19. So we spent the earlier part of last year, so from February, March, April, observing the impact of the pandemic on the US economy and those of other countries, and the various risk management models and strategies deployed by those governments to manage the impact of the pandemic. And our goal then and now always remain essentially the same. Even if we were to find a COVID-19 vaccine, as it now appears, there are so many different vaccines now in the market, trade disruption would not go away anytime soon. In fact, we continue to believe that trade disruption will likely increase given the current geopolitical tension between the United States and China, the 2 largest economies in the world, as they continue to compete for global leadership in technology and economy. So any company that operate within this international trading environment must and should have a plan on how to manage trade risk. In the book, we provided a 3-step approach on how to do essentially that. The first step would be to track and monitor ongoing geopolitical developments and flashpoints that could potentially impact your business. And then the second step would be to do a risk-benefit analysis of that geopolitical flashpoint and development. And then the third step would be to mitigate and respond using the various risk management strategies that we've outlined in the book, such as customs strategies, export control strategies, tax planning strategies. So in a nutshell, the book is supposed to be a useful tool for the business community to help them do their job much better. We hope that the book is not boring and that you find it useful. Thank you very much.
In Kuala Lumpur, the Inter-Pacific Bar Association and the Malaysian Bar Council hosted a half-day conference on how to train to become a free trade agreement negotiator. We had 3 speakers not included in this abridged version. Raj Bala, Associate Dean, University of Kansas Law School, Peter Tritt, Director, Asia Pacific, New Zealand Law School, and U.S. Attorney Negosum Vangam. At the conference, the Trade Negotiations Training Center was launched. Brief introductions were made by Stephen Thiru, President of the Malaysian Bar Council, and by Varya Simpson, Chair of the IPBA Legal Standards and Training Committee. We had a filmed presentation from Chil Soo Kim. Chil Soo Kim is a former South Korean Minister of Trade, Industry, and Energy and a Charter Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. He is the founder and head of the Institute for Investment and Trade in Seoul, Korea, which is participating in the new Trade Negotiations Training Center as head of its Asian chapter in collaboration with the Global Development Law and Consulting Group in Washington, D.C.
According to the WTO, as of February 1 this year, there are 419 FTAs in force in the world. According to the ADB FTA database, as of January 2016, there are 140 FTAs in force in Asia, 11 FTAs signed, and another 64 FTAs under negotiation. The most significant FTA concluded in the region so far is the TPP, which covers 12 countries in Asia and the Pacific. While not yet ratified, this agreement promises to be an important landmark in the development of regional economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region. The recent proliferation of FTAs in the Asia-Pacific region is placing increasing strains on the negotiating capacity of Asian countries, particularly developing and the least developed countries in the region. The sheer number of FTA negotiations is a burden in itself, and the knowledge of technical and legal issues which FTA negotiations now require presents a formidable challenge to trade negotiations. The subject matter covered by FTAs vary from one FTA to another. However, many recent FTAs have included provisions on a wide range of issues. The TPP agreement contains 29 chapters. FTAs recently included all or many of the following topics: trade in goods, trade in services, rules of origin, customs procedures, trade remedies, technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, electronic commerce, trade in financial services, trade in telecommunications services, investment, movement of natural persons, intellectual property rights, competition policy, government procurement, consultation, and dispute settlement. Negotiating FTAs with such a large scope requires a full understanding of trade rules, particularly the WTO rules in the areas covered. More recently, moreover, many FTAs cover WTO plus elements, which could complicate the tasks of the negotiators. Without training opportunities, negotiators are likely to muddle through the many complex issues without having a full grasp of the issues at hand. There have been various efforts to address the trade negotiation capacity gap issues in Asia at the level of national governments and international organizations, as well as at the university level. The Australian government and the Asian Development Bank hosted trade negotiation workshops in 2004 and 2008, respectively. In 2004, the American University Law School launched the first ever law school negotiation training program based on 6 courses written by Mr. Bruce Aiken. While these initiatives have been helpful and are to be applauded, we are clearly not doing enough to address the serious problem of trade negotiation capacity gap in the developing and the least developed countries in Asia. The explosion of FTAs in Asia means that the region's trade negotiators will be under mounting strain to handle these new trends. This serious problem needs to be addressed fundamentally and systematically. I believe the answer lies in the launching of training programs on behalf of developing and least developed countries in the region.
Our next speaker was Tan Sri Dr. Rebecca Fatima St. Maria. Rebecca is the Secretary General of the Malaysian Ministry of Trade and Industry.
What we saw happening was the fact that our neighbors were engaging, our competitors were engaging in trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements. The UNDP did a study for us and that provided us the leeway to whether or not we should, make a bid. We knew going in that it was more than just your average trade agreement, and at that time we were not prepared to make those important calls, so we had to step out. We had to go through an internal process of convincing our cabinet that this was something we should do. If rules making was on trade was going to take place in this forum, and being an open and trading nation, we were not there while the rules were being written, it could work to our disadvantage. It is important for Malaysia to be in the room if the rules are going to be written. Yes, this is an agreement which would involve some rules making, which may come back to haunt us. What we learned from the TPP was, this is not your average trade agreement, and therefore the noise was coming not from industry, but from civil society, from politicians, opposition politicians.
Our next and final speaker was our conference moderator, Bruce Aiken. Bruce is a managing partner of the Aiken Berlin law firm. He was named in the Washington Post as an international super lawyer in 2014, 2015, and 2016. He has been appointed to the dispute resolution panels of the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, the WTO, and the WIPO. He authored and taught the major training trade negotiators in the Master of Law program at American University. He also taught at Georgetown University Law School and at the University of Techno Law School in Malaysia. He founded the Global Development Law and Consulting Group and the Trade Negotiations Training Center, which Global runs in collaboration with ITI.
I want to talk about how to negotiate FTAs. We heard from a number of speakers about the complexity of FTAs. Chul Soo Kim spoke about it at length. I think Tan Sri Rebecca was terrific in discussing the virtual explosion of issues she had to deal with. First, Malaysia's in, then they're out because their laws aren't quite up to snuff, and then they get back in because they don't want these agreements made without their participation. And those words in her presentation were, for me, the heart of the reason we're launching a trade agreement negotiations center to deal with the trade negotiations capacity gap that developing countries and least developed countries have, some of which are in Asia. So guess what? The developed countries have staff. 27 lawyers at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and hundreds of economists and support staff. In the European Union, 26 lawyers and hundreds of economists and support staff. Bangladesh has 3. How do you think those 3 lawyers, plus whatever support staff they have, keep track of all the issues? They can't. They're forced to either not participate or try to participate but doing so on an uninformed basis, or rely on a traditional friend to say sign or don't sign. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that the traditional friend, maybe it's Singapore, telling Cambodia, sign or don't sign. I don't think you're going to find Singapore looking into the sensitivity within the Cambodian economy at the same level as the Cambodian government would. That's why certain academics have said we need training. There's a UN study done in 2010 which talked about Africa and how trade capacity building is necessary because they cannot meaningfully participate in these negotiations. This is not a new issue. As Chil Soo Kim mentioned, the government of Australia and the Asian Development Bank did training only for government officials, not for lawyers, and not for industry people in 2004 and 2008. We're not here today to teach you how to be a trade negotiator, but rather to give you an appetizer, to give you a taste of what is involved in doing this job. And so I'm really happy to be here because for more than 10 years since I worked with Claudio Grossman, who's from Chile, the Dean of American University Law School, and created that course load, which I taught for 5 years on how to be a trade negotiator, I've wanted to do a center for training trade negotiators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me in this interview. I'm Raj Bala. I'm the Bredesen Distinguished Professor at the University of Kansas Law School. I'm also a senior advisor at Dentons in Kansas City, and I write a column on point for Bloomberg Quint in Mumbai.
Good evening, Professor Raj Bala, and thank you very much again for agreeing for me to interview you on this companion piece of the book. Okay, without further ado, I do know that your time is limited, so I'm going to quickly jump into the question. As COVID-19 has accelerated the digital revolution and the so-called fourth industrial revolution, which emerging technology do you think will accelerate the contraction in global trade, and what should the business community be doing in preparation for this change?
That's an excellent question, and it's a complex one. Let me try and at least offer a few different perspectives. The first is 3D printing is perhaps an obvious example where we would see a diminution in production, exportation, cross-border trade in merchandise if we are approaching a world in which more and more people have access to 3D printers. They can obtain the merchandise they want right from their desk in their office or their home. So for example, if someone wants to buy cutlery or even small furniture, that can come out of a 3D printer in their home or office. Second, I think, piece of this would be robots. We're seeing more and more the substitution of labor by capital, and here the capital are the robots. They're doing more and more production and are part of the supply chain, and that at least has an effect on employment. it could actually stimulate goods production and trade, depending on the sector and depending on consumer demand. That leads to a third point, consumer demand or aggregate demand. As populations age in many developed countries, Japan, Korea, and the US, Europe, the amount of goods that the elderly consume may fall, or at least the pattern of what they're consuming changes. And so that kind of goes in the other direction, suggesting that we may see some diminution of trade as a result of just aging. And then finally, to return to your starting point about the digital revolution, in the services area, in services trade, we are seeing more and more use of algorithms. For example, in banking and securities regulation, what used to be known as program trading. We're in the legal sector, where sometimes civil discovery or even perhaps editing can be done using algorithms. And there again, we're seeing a substitution away from labor, in this case, professional services, in favor of something digitized. And that could result in a diminution of trade in professional services. So there's no one easy answer to your excellent and complex question, but those are some trends I think we're seeing.
Thank you very much, Professor. And speaking about the acceleration of digital revolution and services trade that you just talked about, I know there's been several attempts to have some sort of an international agreement on services to no avail so far. I know the last such attempt at a multilateral level was TISA, Trade in Services Agreement, back in 2013. Do you think the time is right in light of COVID-19 to revisit one such agreement?
I do not think the time is ripe to revisit the Trade and Services Agreement, TISA, at the multilateral level. I don't think there's a sufficient degree of interest among all 164 WTO members to forge a multilateral TISA. I think it's possible that it could be resurrected as a plurilateral agreement, and that's where, as your question rightly stated, that's where it was sort of left off a few years ago. However, I think that there are stronger efforts being made at, for example, the free trade agreement level or the customs union level, where we're seeing, for example, in USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, we're seeing strong services chapters, and including special chapters on financial services and indeed also on e-commerce. I also think that the time is not ripe at the WTO level for a multilateral TISA, because I think there are two far higher priorities. One is the fishing subsidies agreement, which affects millions, if not hundreds of millions of people in developing countries if we could get to a fishing subsidies agreement. And second, of course, is reform and the rebirth of the WTO appellate body.
Thank you. Now, at this point, it is widely understood that the increasing struggle between the US and China for global leadership in economics and technology sphere will likely persist, at least in the foreseeable future. Even in a Biden-Harris administration, what should the business community be doing to mitigate the likely impact of this foreseeable risk?
Well, the narrow answer to that question, I would suggest, is to reconfigure and rethink and reconfigure supply chains, to try and conceive of the Sino-American trade war, which could become a Cold War. Some say it already is, some say it's not. To rethink their supply chains so that they are hedged for this conflict. If supply chains are running from China to the U.S. and businesses anticipate that the trade war is going to worsen and may become a Cold War if it's not already, then they want to look at moving those supply chains to countries, say, such as India or Vietnam or Thailand or the Philippines, or even bringing them back to the U.S. or Canada, whichever the country of the company involved is, the home country. I think also they should, so in other words, the way to think about it is that the trade war and the possibility of its exacerbation is now a political and a legal risk that needs to be thought through in terms of supply chain locations and management. Likewise, they have to be aware, businesses, of trade sanctions and export controls, which do apply to China, particularly in the aftermath of the Chinese Communist Party's imposition of the national security law on Hong Kong. And finally, I would suggest to the business community, going back to the wording of your question, that the struggle for leadership is what underlies it is quite possibly ideological competition. That the US and China are really offering two different systems of government. They're offering two different conceptions of the relationship between individuals and government. And those systems are likely to compete for some time, at least under the present leaderships in both countries.
Hello, Jen.
Hi, Gautam. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Excellent.
Thank you very much for agreeing, for being a commentator on the book first, and for also agreeing to do this interview in light of COVID-19. I would have preferred that we do it in person, but unfortunately, this is now the new reality now, so we have to make do with the virtual interviews. Yeah. So thank you very much again for being flexible. So as you know well, the book itself, Trade Crash, is a book vid. So this is the companion piece of the interviews, or the companion piece of the book. So I'm going to be asking you a few questions about international trade in general and about Wisconsin in particular, given your Wisconsin experiences working with the WDC. So what opportunities does the state of Wisconsin provide for businesses seeking trade assistance to help them navigate the very complex trade environment?
That's a great question, Gautam. And the state of Wisconsin recognizes the complexity that exporting brings to businesses. Not only do you have to figure out the right product and service line to appeal to a whole different area of the world, but you also have to be able to comply with a broad range of complexity that occurs when you go to a different country with different laws and maybe different regional or local requirements that might apply to your services or goods. For that reason, there are a wide range of different ways that the state of Wisconsin supports business. One of the first ways that I would really recommend for a lot of businesses looking to get into exporting for the first time, or even just to make sure that their exporting program is working the way that it should, is to work with the Export Tech program that is sponsored by the state. An Export Tech is a proven export strategy development program that's basically like a boot camp. It's designed to speed a company's go-to-market timeline by developing a customized international growth plan. The way that this is done is by having the participating companies bring their A-team, their C-suite, to the programming, where they get access to a wide range of topic matter experts, individual coaching, consulting, customized service, and guided development of an international growth plan. After providing all the tools by talking with accountants who have experience in international, lawyers, export and import professionals, marketing professionals, after getting all of those pieces through education. The capstone of that program is a situation where the company itself evaluates the various different markets and identifies the top 3 markets that they would be pursuing, and gives them a chance to really think strategically about how to get to that next stage and how to really break into that market in a very thoughtful and strategic manner. So that is one of the biggest ways I think that a company can really boost their exporting expertise and also their exporting experience, to really get that confidence that you're going to get in there and do it the right way. There are 2 different grant programs that are offered for companies that are looking to export. The first is directly to the company itself through the International Market Access Grant. This is a grant that provides funding to support a company's specific export development and deployment strategy. And it can be used in a wide range of different ways. It could be used to, for example, if you're looking to translate your website into a language that would target the market that you're looking to export to. For example, if you wanted to change your English-only website to be accessible in Spanish or Mandarin, then this funding can be used for that. This funding can be used to support the company in going to a trade conference in a specific region in the hopes that you're able to land those sales that you need in order to get your product or services into a specific region or a specific country. There's a wide range of different things that you can use this International Market Access Grant to do, to kind of get you to the next stage, to give you the resources you need to support what you need to become a better exporter. The other grant program is the Collaborative Market Access Grant. It provides funding to industry-focused groups. So for example, if you're in the ag industry, we provide funding directly to your industry trade group potentially, and they can use it in a way that will best support exporting in that particular industry. There are 2 other ways that the state of Wisconsin supports exports that I'd like to highlight before closing it out. But we've got a global trade venture, and those are basically scenarios where the state identifies specific regions that companies in the state would be interested in pursuing. And what the state does is that the market development directors really work closely with the company to identify what their needs are. Do they need a distributor? Are they looking for potentially a manufacturer to help get their products, components potentially manufactured in that region so that they're able to get the products and services pulled together in the way that they want? And what they do is they really identify partners within that country. If they're looking for sales in that country, is there potentially somebody who could be an agent for them to get out there and do the sales that they need, or the marketing that they need within that particular region or country? And what the state does is they identify various different potential partners and arrange a meeting for the companies and those particular partners, because really the best way to figure out if you're compatible, if you're going to have a great business relationship, is to get together, to talk, maybe do a tour of the facilities for that particular potential partner and see how they do business and make sure that it's compliant with how you want to do business. So that's a big part of what the state does to coordinate a variety of different global trade ventures in different places in the world, and to bring the Wisconsin businesses and set them up so they're maximizing their time while they're within that country. The final way that the state supports exporters, and I guess not the final, but the final one that I'd like to talk to you about during my very brief time with you, is through our global network. We have in-country trade representatives covering 96 countries and territories throughout the world, and their entire purpose is to provide Wisconsin companies with insights and contacts that you might need to develop and execute your market-specific business development strategies. So they're able to do in-depth industry, product, and market assessments, partner searches, meeting facilitations. They're able to assist in evaluating the various different rules and regulations potentially of that area, and other types of customized projects that will help you to feel confident when you decide that it's time to go and export in a specific area. So those are the big ways that you can really maximize your exporting through assistance with the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah, Jen, thank you very much. It sounds like Wisconsin does have a pretty good plan on how to attract foreign direct investment and foreign businesses into the state. Now, in your commentary in Trade Crash, you talked about some of the obstacles to embracing globalization in Wisconsin. Now, are there any advice you can provide to the Wisconsin government or the business community alike as to why they should see globalization as an opportunity and not as a threat?
Absolutely, Gosan. Globalization is really meant to be a way to promote efficiencies through the competition and division of labor. It's a way to identify what it is that you do the best and to maximize your ability to be competitive throughout the world. It allows people and economies to focus on really what they do best and to send that out into the world so that people can benefit from those. By providing access to more capital flows, technology, cheaper imports, and larger export markets, really that's what globalization is about. And I'd like to give an example of an iconic Wisconsin product. We've got Harley Davidson motorcycles. It's a name that's known throughout the world. If the market was just Wisconsin, you can imagine that the demand for the motorcycles would be different than if you're able to expand that market nationwide, expand that market regionally throughout North America or throughout the world. And really, Harley Davidson is known for quality. It's known for its iconic brand, and really taking that to the next level by not just sharing it with the folks around you, but also taking it all the way across the world and providing access to this iconic brand is really a way that has made, that Harley Davidson has kind of made their mark. And that's similar with other companies. If you're just focusing on your state, if you're only focusing on the Midwest region or the nation, your market's going to be substantially smaller than if you're able to expand your reach beyond the borders and to provide your quality services and goods to those who really want it and need it throughout the world.
Hello, good morning, Mr. Hendry. How are you doing today?
I'm just fine. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you very much again for accepting to do this this short video, which, as you know well, supplements our co-written book, Trade Crash.
Yeah, pleasure to do it.
So thank you very much. So before we get started, I am going to make a quick introduction. I already know who you are, but for the general audience who don't know who you are, so I will briefly give a quick introduction. So Mr. Hendry is a retired vice chairman and chief legal officer for Colgate-Palmolive, and he's had 40-year plus dealing with all aspects of international trade issues. We asked him to do a prologue of the book, which he kindly agreed to do so, and you can check out the prologue when you buy the book. And the long form of his introduction of his biography is in the book, so when you have time, please feel free to do so. And Mr. Hendry is also currently working on a cultural memoir, which will cover a lot of concerns that he has had over his experiences dealing with business issues. So thank you again, Mr. Hendry, and we can begin the interview.
Well, thank you for the very nice introduction, and I was happy to help with the book. It's a great book, and hopefully people will find my little piece interesting, so glad I can help and happy to answer any questions you want.
Okay. In the book, you write that to have allowed globalization to force Americans to compete against foreign manufacturers running 19th century operations with no protection and to not have an adequate national transition plan was a mistake of colossal proportion. Now, what specifically could have been done to help with such transitions to try to avoid gutting the American industry?
Okay, so, you kind of touch on it. in the book when you talk about the Ross Perot movement during the Clinton years. And of course, you know, like most political things, that's all boiled down into a little soundbite. But the point is that taking down the tariffs, opening the borders to globalization was about as major a shift in our economic environment as one could possibly imagine. I mean, this was not just some changing of the tariff on beef or something like that. This was a huge change in the way our economy was going to operate. And it was inevitable that there were going to be winners and losers in that. But what we needed was a national plan which took account of that and made sure that the transition was done in a way that protected the citizens of this country. So, for example, to the best of my knowledge, very little, if anything, was done to ensure that the worker rights, wages, environmental protections of the industries that were taking over from our industries were sufficiently strict that it put the American businesses and those foreign companies on some sort of even footing. Now, of course, you're going to have some disparities, but the point I'm trying to make is that there really wasn't a plan to deal with that. It was kind of assumed that it would just kind of all work out. And of course, it didn't work out. And we lost industry after industry after industry. So that today we can't even get ventilators made here or masks for our people or PPE. You know, at one time we had a huge portion of the world's textile industry. And in fact, the area where I live now was kind of one of the centers of that. And if you go to any of the places where there once was a thriving textile industry, whether it's down here in the South or up in New York State, along the interstate highway, you just see what happened. These places once were vibrant cities like Utica, New York, are now, they're coming back. But what are they coming back with? They try to do theater and sports and stuff like that. But they were places that were created by the huge industrial base of America. And nothing was done to make sure that when these doors were open, that there would be fair competition. So that's one thing. Secondly, there's no question that even if you had done that, there would be some dislocation. I mean, it's kind of inherent in the process that if you're trying to go to places to make things more efficiently, they're going to be having lower wage rates and things like that. Not to the degree that we allowed, where you can have a company in Eastern Europe or Mexico, which basically has no environmental protections, or China. And meanwhile, you've got the EPA with 1 million rules for the American company. So we didn't do what we needed to do, but even if we had, there would have been some dislocation. But the trick there is to retrain your workforce. You know, even today, we have an enormous industrial base, but it has shifted from basic industries and manufacturing and farming to high tech and things like that. And that's fine, but you've got to help the people who have been dislocated by the events to deal with the new economy. We didn't do any of that, you know? I mean, now we're starting to do a little of it here and there, but our education system just didn't come to the rescue of those people. And so they were just left to flounder. And, you know, it's kind of like, when you look at it, you know, it's kind of like we just let the chips fall where they may. You know, a lot of parallels to the way we've been handling the coronavirus. You know, well, we'll let the governors do it, you know, no coordination or anything. So I do think that really, it would have been tough no matter what, okay? But if it had been done more gradually, if we had policed the situations in our trading partners to make sure that before we said, okay, our markets are open to you, that they were competing fairly. And I don't want to define what that means, but competing fairly. And to the extent that even with that, there was dislocation, you know, that we provided the backdrop to help those people, those industries, those regions that were affected by it to make the adjustment. I mean, you know, you just have to look at what we call things today. So, you know, Ohio, parts of Michigan, parts of Indiana, things like that. We call it the Rust Belt. That wasn't the Rust Belt. That was what built America. And now it's the Rust Belt. Well, the reason it's the Rust Belt is we pulled the plug on it. And we shouldn't have done that. You know, it was the ultimate of elitism and arrogance to have allowed that to happen. And a lot of people have suffered substantially and continue to suffer because of it. You know, all you have to do, I worked in Detroit for 6 years, so I've seen it kind of firsthand. And it's terrible. It's terrible. I mean, what we did to that city is just a scandal beyond all things. And it's because we let the auto industry, you know, hang out there. Anyway, that's a long answer, and I'm sorry, perhaps too long an answer, but, you know, basically it needed to have a national plan. You just can't say, oh, well, we'll pass some legislation, we'll take the tariffs down and the chips will fall where they may. There needed to be a national plan, and part of it needed to be education, and part of it needed to be conditions to people getting access to our markets, and precious little, if anything, in that direction was done.
So your diagnosis, from what I'm getting, is that we needed to have a national plan to help those workers that were impacted by globalization. Now, in your powerful interview with Mike Pierce, you forcefully told the story of the impact on American families of the closing of Youngstown's Sheet and Tube Company and the diminution of Warren Tool Company. Now, what happened to the workers laid off by this event?
Well, of course, you know, you don't know for sure, you know, other than anecdotally. They scattered, I think, to the winds. You know, Youngstown today is a shadow of its former self. I mean, there was a time when Youngstown, Ohio was not some decrepit place racked by poverty and crime, but it was a vibrant middle-class community, like Detroit was at one time. And that's all gone. And the population of Toledo now is about 40% of what it was in 1970. So if you adjust for the fact that the country is almost twice the size, you're looking at a population of 20 or 30% on an adjusted basis to what it was. And it's one of the poorest places in the country. It's one of the highest crime places. So the people who could get out, the people like Mike, who were smart enough and skilled enough and educated enough to be able to move, did. And as you mentioned, you can read in the book, the life he's had has not been a bowl of cherries. It's been very rough, and he's just one of these people who will survive. But not everybody. I mean, you got to remember, he's a guy who got out of college and was put into management ranks in 2 years. He's the top of the heap. A lot of people didn't have that. And you can trace the crime, the drugs, the suicides, you can trace a lot of that stuff to this. I mean, put yourself in that position where all of a sudden you no longer have a job. You have no prospect for a job because that industry has kind of gone away and it's the only thing you know. And think about how you would handle that with you and your family when you've got a wife and 3 kids.
Yeah, I think it must have been very, very tough for Mike Pierce, but I'm glad to hear that at least he is doing quite well as we speak. Now, you mentioned 7 projects which you feel will be necessary for the revitalization of the American economy, such as ending agency theory and shareholder value management and prohibiting American corporations from reincorporating overseas. Can you comment on the relative priorities of these 7 steps? Which step would you recommend being, I guess, done first?
Okay.
If
So
you have a plan.
I really don't agree that you need to prioritize them. You know, we're in a very bad way right now, and we're going to have to do a lot of it, maybe not all of it, a lot of it at the same time. We are an enormous country. We have 350 million people. We have some of the best universities in the world. We have some of the biggest companies in the world that are capable of doing things. And if we can't walk and chew gum at one time to fix some of this stuff, it's only because of a lack of wanting to do it. And I do not think that the problem over the years has been lack of capability. It's been a lack of will. So, you'll have to wait for my book to get the plan. There will be a plan in there. And I don't pretend to, be an expert in a lot of these things. And there will be some things that might be great ideas and some that aren't great ideas. But they are all things worth considering. And, I'll just outline kind of maybe some big buckets. All right. So the first bucket is we absolutely need structural reform in the government. Okay. Our government does not work anymore. It's as simple as that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is Citizens United. And, that basically politics in this country got taken over by money. And as a result, the type of people we have now in our legislature are the wrong kind of people. And now, of course, any generalization is unfair, and to the extent that there's some really wonderful senator or congressperson, I apologize and consider you an exception. But by and large, it is populated by people who are career politicians, and when they're not politicians, they're lobbyists. And what they do is they spend their time catering to special interests, to their political leadership or whatever, because that's what they need to do to survive. They're not leaders. They don't have independent thoughts. And, when you see constantly, time and time again, a block of Republicans voting one way and a block of Democrats voting the other way, there's something wrong. Those people were elected by the people of their states or district to go there and to fix problems, and they don't do that. They just sit there. I mean, you're probably aware of this, but in Washington, both the Republicans and the Democrats have a facility, and every relatively junior member of Congress is expected, under fear of not having support from their party, to go there and spend 20 hours a week raising money. I mean, it's just awful. So, so that we've got a very broken system, and it's because of no term limits. It's because of Citizens United. It's because of the seniority system. I live in North Carolina. I did not vote for or have the opportunity to vote for or against Mitch McConnell. But Mitch McConnell is going to have so much more of an influence on the things that affect our lives here than Senator Burr or Senator Tillis. And that shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that way. It's fine for them to have a structure and an organization and a collaboration, but that's not what we've got now. It's almost a military organization. So structural reform, getting rid of the lobbyists, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when there were no lobbyists or no lobbyists to speak of. And there was a big debate, this is probably back in the 70s, a big debate of whether they should allow all these lobbyists. And the justification was that the people in Congress did not have the money and the staff to understand the issues. Now, does anybody really think that that's what lobbyists do, that they're research clerks for the people in Congress? Of course not. There should be no lobbyists, okay, period. I mean, maybe a small cadre of them on certain things, but we need that structural reform in Washington. And I can kind of go on forever on this, so I'll stop. But number one is structural reform, because until we get that, the chance of getting other reforms done in a business-like fashion, which is what needs to happen. I mean, isn't it amazing that you take Boeing, okay? Now, Boeing has had a terrible time with its 737 MAX, but they fixed it, okay? They fixed it. And the reason they fixed it is the way they approach problems in the corporate world. Flash over to Washington, and what you have is you have crisis, and you have hearings, and you have TV cameras, and all this other stuff, and nothing gets fixed. Our road system is a 1960s road system, I mean, and everybody's known that forever, right? So structural reform is number one. Then number two is, I think that we've got to have what is almost like a Marshall Plan for the United States. I mean, cities like Toledo and Cleveland and Detroit and some of these other places that have really been hammered by what we've done in trade, have done a very good job in kind of treading water, and they're coming back. They're Quicken moved into Detroit. That's a huge thing for them. So there is hope and progress, but it shouldn't take us 5 decades to basically rebuild our cities that we have destroyed when we rebuilt Europe in 10 years. Shouldn't happen. So we need that kind of effort and attention to it in order to fix it. You mentioned short-termism and the agency theory. And, the problem with that is that corporations today are not tasked by this society to take the corporate system, I mean, everybody, I guess, knows this, but the reason corporations exist, okay, was to allow people to come together to pool their money so big things could be done. So the AT&Ts of this world could be built, and the Republic Steels of this world could be rebuilt. But the idea was the money came in, they got the business going, they got the profits, they kept building the business more and more and more. That from that, the communities around them, the workers and everybody would do better. And the shareholders would do better. They would get their piece of the action. But between trickle down and agency theory and those sorts of things, that's not what happens now. When these companies prosper, the money is effectively turned back to the shareholders. And, it always struck me as a lawyer ironic that if you look at most corporate statutes, there are very rigorous procedures to liquidate a company. And you've got to have the shareholder approval and so on and so forth. Well, stock buybacks and things like that are a liquidation. What you're doing is you're taking back in the stock and putting the money back in the hands of the shareholders. And if you look at the number of publicly traded companies today and things like that, it's a fraction of what it was 20 years ago. Well, unless we fix this and get companies to basically focus on the quote unquote business as opposed to increasing the wealth of the shareholders and disregarding everybody else, it's very, very hard to see how your industrial base is going to properly function. So all of those things need to be dealt with. Starting place is you got to fix the institution that's supposed to promote it, and that's Washington, D.C.
Okay, Andrew, we have one last question to ask. As we've gone through the election now, and it looks like Biden will be the next president, pending, of course, all the litigation going on in the states. Now, what, in terms of trade, what should we look forward to in terms of trade? Is trade going to be as we've seen in the last 4 years, or is there going to be a change under a Biden administration? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think he's going to have to address the issue. You know, I mean, the problem I've had with Trump's program isn't so much the objective as the technique. You can't use 19th century weapons to fix the imbalance that we have now. I mean, you know, maybe 30 years ago, you know, we could have done better, but we are where we are, okay? And it's laughable that we consider China to be a less developed country. In some ways, I think they're far more developed than the United States is. And they've done it. I mean, they've done it in 30 years. If you want to know what you can do, take a look at China. You know, I mean, as you know, I spent a fair amount of time in China. I even have a tree at our factory in Guangzhou planted in my honor. Apparently that's a common Chinese thing. And it really is, you know, it's amazing to have watched the transformation. You know, my wife tells me she went to China long before I did, working for another company when she was single. And she tells me stories about being in the hotel in Beijing and looking out the window and seeing the fires in the distance. And it was in these local communities, to stay warm, they had to build bonfires, basically. Well, that's all gone. You know, that's all gone. They did it at lightning speed. Now there's price they've paid for that in terms of individual freedoms and stuff like that. And there's a cultural aspect to it too. But the fact of the matter is if you put your nose to the grindstone, you can kind of do amazing things. So, but we are where we are, okay? And I think that with strong resolution, I mean, we still, much of the power in this country is because we are the world's market. I mean, Americans love to shop, they love to buy things. They have a fair amount, well, many people have a fair amount of disposable income. And so we are the market that everybody wants. And that power needs to be used, but in a constructive way to get us back in a much better balance. And, you know, the devil will be in the details, and it's not going to be done by having another round where people who really don't understand the details of it sit there. We need a master plan to take a look at it and to design, you know, take sections and design where we are today and where we want to go. And then, you know, in a very, very respectful, polite way, we have to tell China and some of our other trading partners that this is the way it's going to be. And if not, that's fine. You go your way, we'll go our way. And it should not be this Twitter adversarial, you know, China stinks, we're going to not let any of this, that, and the other thing in. That, you know, I mean, those of you who have worked with the Chinese, you know, it's a very polite society. Saving face is very important in their culture. You have to understand that's who you're dealing with. And, you know, making a fist and yelling at them and tweeting about how bad they are and the China virus and all the other stuff is not the way to deal with the Chinese people and the Chinese leadership. You're not going to get anywhere with them. What you have to do is persuade them that it is in their best interest, because make no doubt, that's what the Chinese are about, in their best interest, as well as our own, to do certain things. But first, you have to figure out what those certain things are. And it's not so simple as, raising the tariffs on one or two items.
Well, thank you very much again, Andy. And when can we expect your book to be published?
Sometime next year. Sooner the better, but there's how writing is. You write when the muses are there, and I'm
Indeed.
hoping they're around much. They are right now, but you never know if they go on vacation. It may take a little longer, but we're going to shoot for the first half of next year.
Awesome. Again, thank you very much again for agreeing to do this interview, and it was a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure too. Take care now.
Bye.
This concluding interview will be conducted by Virginie Lecaillon, a contributor to this book. Hi, Virginie. The general counsel of the largest division of a global energy technology company, to whom I must say I'm happily married. Virginie?
Hi, Bruce. So I'm here to interview Bruce Aitken. He's the principal author with Engos and Fonkum, and they are 9 contributors of Trade Crash 2. So Bruce, did the February 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine signal the end of globalization, or is it merely a recalibration?
It's a recalibration. Virginie, the accession to the World Trade Organization, the so-called WTO, of China in 2001 and Russia in 2012 resulted in changes to trade. Predictably, it increased. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the resulting sanctions changed that substantially. A shift has occurred in the center of gravity of trade from transatlantic to trans-Pacific. The International Monetary Fund, the so-called IMF, as far back as 2020, predicted that by 2024, the largest economic bloc would be in Asia.
So Bruce, you addressed the disruptive impact of COVID-19 in Trade Crash 2. How significant was this, and how significant will it be in further disrupting the global supply chain?
Well, COVID-19 and its variants, including, among others, Alpha, Beta, Delta, Influenza, and Omicron, accelerated the disruption of the global supply chain, which is the engine and the avenue by which trade occurs. But the end of globalization is not imminent. Rather, a recalibration of globalization away from past patterns and towards the global south, for example, Africa, among others, e.g. the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, is occurring and will continue to occur.
So really, what lessons have we learned from the 2019-2021 response to COVID-19, such as in Europe, for instance?
Well, your commentary addressed that thoughtfully. A variety of factors led to COVID mismanagement in Northern Europe and in the US. These included overconfidence, for example, President Trump claiming deaths would stop at 60,000 in the US, now they're over 1 million. Cultural political factors, not just in Europe, but in states in the US such as Texas, wherein the hope in some governments for herd immunity, namely let it run its course, COVID, and let people become self-immunized, catered to by minimal response. Also, over-reliance on modeling, and finally, maintaining proper supplies of first responder stockpiles. We all remember the disaster, particularly in New York City, where insufficient beds, much less oxygen tanks and so on, led to COVID illnesses being improperly treated and to COVID deaths. Until COVID, trade was increasing worldwide. However, the seemingly permanent US-China trade war, Russian sanctions, and the ongoing nature of COVID will continue to disrupt the global supply chain. As to COVID itself, the political economic impulse to avoid economic destruction in the future will be tempered by past mistakes.
Okay, so in the first trade crash, you correctly made a number of predictions, right? You talked about how you predicted the 2020 and 2022 elections results. You also predicted the fact that President Trump would contract COVID-19. You talked about the number of US and global deaths from COVID-19. And finally, you talked about fractures and fissures in the global supply chain. So what else do you see in the future now?
Well, I wish I had a happier answer. Supply chain disruptions will continue. Despite partial containment of COVID, the February 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine has further disrupted world trade. So, like a series of earthquakes and aftershocks, as opposed to a tsunami, we see ongoing supply chain disruptions, a partial recession in 2023, and worse in 2024.
Any final comments you want to add?
Yes, Virginie, thank you. God bless you and your country and our country and you and yours.
Well, thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you.